So, what I'm going to talk about is things that I hate about Toronto. First of all, I'll start off by saying that, I've met many wonderful people in Toronto. I've got family who I love and care about very much, who live in the greater Toronto area. I've got friends living in Toronto, and I've had many great times in Toronto and come across many great people in Toronto. So, by no means do I feel this way about all Toronto people. But this is basically going out to the grumpy assholes of Toronto, the scumbags of Toronto. You know who you are. And just generally things about Toronto that need to drastically improve for me to even have a favorable opinion about these areas of Toronto. First things first, just traffic in Toronto is just awful. It is such a pain in the ass commuting around Toronto at all. For Toronto to only have about 3 million people, but yet have the sixth worst traffic in the world, have the worst traffic in North America, despite the fact that Los Angeles and New York City are much bigger cities than Toronto. Toronto still has, despite that fact, Toronto still has worse traffic than those two cities. And you hear all these politicians, you hear all these various people talking about how horrible traffic is in Toronto, and you get these stupid, useless politicians in Toronto that love to sit and talk, like they have all these stupid pie-in-the-sky ideas that don't make any sense about how to improve traffic, but no one really does anything about it. Like, I know a long time ago, there was this one politician in Toronto, I think his name was Art Eggleton, a former mayor of Toronto. He was proposing making a section of Yonge Street one-way northbound and a section of Bay Street one-way southbound. And people bitched and complained so much about it that he never ended up going through with it. I hear that at one point in Toronto, I think back in the 60s or 70s, I hear that they wanted to extend the Gardiner Expressway out to Scarborough to end at the 401 in Scarborough instead of just ending at the Don Valley Parkway like it does now. And again, people in the east end of Toronto being a bunch of, some of the people out there are a bunch of crybabies with a NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. They bitched and complained about how they don't want the Gardiner Expressway running through the east end of Toronto to end up in Scarborough, so they backed off on that idea too. Like, for example, I've seen some cities like Montreal, for example. Yes, Montreal has awful traffic as well, too. But at least they have a better highway system than Toronto. Montreal has more highways crossing it, even though it's, by population, not quite as big as Toronto is. And if you think that riding public transit across Toronto is any better than sitting in traffic, maybe in some ways it is because you're not spending as much money on public transit. But Toronto's public transit system sucks as well, too. The Toronto Transit Commission, or TTC, it's a horrible system. So often it's running behind schedule. And so often it's so severely overcrowded. I mean, there have been times that I've been taking buses or trains in Toronto that I have to wait for the next one to come because the one that comes through, the first one that comes through the station or comes by that stop is so severely overcrowded that there's just no way you can get on it. And let's talk about Toronto Transit employees. They've got to be some of the grumpiest, most pissed off asshole bitches that I've encountered in my life. Yes, TTC has some great people working for them, but they also have a lot of disgruntled, grumpy assholes that have no business being in any kind of customer service job. What the hell are they so grumpy about? I mean, I understand they have to deal with a lot of bitch, miserable Toronto people, but at the same time, from what I hear, TTC employees top out somewhere in the neighborhood of about 35 to 40 bucks an hour. As a matter of fact, there's a number of TTC employees I've heard that make over $100,000 a year. If you hate your job so fucking much, then quit and go find yourself another fucking job. Instead of abusing the general public like that. That brings me to my next point. What the hell is up so many Toronto people's asses? Why are so many Toronto people such miserable bitches? I've traveled all across Canada. I've been to every large city in Canada, and Toronto people are by far the grumpiest, most bitchiest, pissiest people in Canada. What the hell are you so pissed off about? You hate Toronto so much? Then move. Get the fuck out of there. I moved out of Toronto many years ago. And I couldn't be happier. It's a horrible city. It's a toxic city. And the initial reason why I initially moved out of Toronto was because it's just too expensive a city. It's ridiculously expensive. But once I left there, I discovered what a horrible, toxic, miserable cesspool of a city it is. And I couldn't be more glad to be out of there. And I suggest to people, obviously a lot of people living in Toronto are grumpy assholes, get the fuck out if you hate it so much. And I'll tell you the truth. Some people are probably thinking to me, well, why do I bother to go to Toronto? As I said at the beginning of this video, I've got family and friends, and I enjoy going down there to visit them. Sometimes I'll go to special events like concerts or whatever. And I mean, it's not everything that I hate about Toronto, but this particular video, I'm talking about the things that I hate about Toronto. And I just touched on it a few seconds ago. Another thing I hate about Toronto, it's so ridiculously expensive. I don't know how the hell some people manage to survive in Toronto, especially if you're earning minimum wage. Like minimum wage is $14 an hour. It was supposed to be going up to $15 an hour as of January 1st, 2015, or sorry, January 1st, 2019, but this fucking asshole of a premier that Ontarians voted in named Doug Ford, he's decided to freeze minimum wage at $14 an hour. Like, I don't know how anyone manages to live in Toronto if they're making less than, say, $100,000 a year. I don't know, I've been to Vancouver, I've been to Montreal, I've been to Calgary, I've been to Edmonton, I've been to Winnipeg, I've been to Ottawa, I've been to Quebec City. And yes, all those other cities, they do have their problems too. And you get grumpy asshole people in those cities too. But they're not nearly as miserable as Toronto people. Again, I say, I'm going to repeat it like I did at the beginning of the video. This to me is not a reflection of all the people living in Toronto. I've got family living in Toronto that I love and care about very much. I've got friends in Toronto that are great people. I've met many great, wonderful people in Toronto. One of the things I do love about Toronto is how multicultural a city it is. But even though I was born in Toronto, I spent a good part of my life in the Greater Toronto area. Would I ever move back to Toronto? No fucking way in hell.